welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jenn, your host for today, and today I'm here with the author of a really fun and thoughtful book that has recently made its US debut.
So my name is Louise Hare. My book is called Aldridge Regrets, which is sort of a golden age murder mystery set in 1936 in London, and also mostly on the Queen Mary traveling to New York.
Very nice. So this is your US debut, but not your first book. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So my first book was called This Lovely City. But yeah, I think you can get hold of it in the US, but it wasn't sort of published officially.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And I'm wondering, what draws you to historical fiction in general? Because your previous book was also set in the past, right? In the early 20th century, or?
So the first book was set sort of 1948 and 1950. So this latest one's gone a little bit further back again. But I think for me, I guess it's sort of interesting from a UK perspective, there aren't many Black authors writing historical fiction. It's just a genre that I love reading. And I used to get really annoyed that I could never find characters in those books who sort of looked like me or that I could relate to on that level. So, as they say, if you can't find the book, you should write it yourself. So that's kind of what I'm doing.
That's great. Yeah. And I'm so excited that this book exists now because it's a really fun story. And Lena, our protagonist, is a really great point of view character. So let's get into talking about that book a little bit. Did you have an inception point for this book? I know that authors find the question, where do your ideas come from, extremely annoying. But I'm wondering, instead, was there an image that occurred to you, or a line of dialogue, or a particular character? What was your entryway?
So strangely, it kind of came out of my first book. Basically, I was doing a master's in creative writing. And so you have deadlines, you have to submit stories and different things at very strict points during each sort of academic year. So I had to send in a short story. It had to be crime or historical. I just decided to combine both. And because I was writing my first novel, which has a lot of jazz in it as well, so that jazz is a common theme across my books. There was a scene in a jazz club, and one of my characters just looks back and notices this woman on stage. And I just started to think about who this woman might be. And then sort of gradually she turned into Lena.
That is super interesting. Lena is such a great character. So let's talk about her a little bit. Obviously one of the most interesting things about her is that she is currently passing. She is a Black woman who is living her life as a white woman. And I'm wondering about, to live like that requires to walk a very fine line and to put a lot of effort into a kind of performance. And I'm wondering, how did you conceptualize her journey with that? Because, when you live like that, you're really sort of part of two groups, but also kind of between them, if that makes sense. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about her experience and what helped you shape it.
Yeah, I guess I was just sort of thinking about how I've sort of reconciled my own identity, because I'm sort of biracial. I would never pass as white. But I think you lean towards what people assume you are. So people look at me and they see Black, whereas I think Lena, people look at her and most people think she's white. So she's kind of skirted the question a lot. She's always sort of gone through life and said that people can decide what I am. But this is the first time that she's sort of actively decided, because she's in first class and all these sort of rich, wealthy people around, she's been told that they wouldn't like it if they found out that there was somebody Black sitting at their table. So she's sort of, consciously made that decision to try and pass as white for the first time. But then she's also, I guess, coming to terms with her father's death. And obviously he could never pass. So she sort of feels like some guilt and shame around what she's doing. So I just thought it would be interesting to sort of explore someone trying to sort of come to terms with their own identity, while murders happen around them.
Yeah, a lot on her plate, right? Like,
yeah.
Yeah, that is so interesting to me. And, it's super interesting that this is all kind of happening while she's on this cross-Atlantic journey, because she's like, is kind of walking between two identities at the moment. And it's also while she is sort of like physically between two places, like the ocean liner and being on this cruise is sort of like this in-between space where she is playing with identity and kind of like deciding who she's going to present herself as. And yeah, I thought it was like a really interesting setup.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it just happens. I don't really plot. So just stuff happens. I guess when I get interested in certain things, so sometimes I'll just be writing and I think, oh, it'd be interesting to have a discussion about this kind of thing. And some things work and some things don't. But yeah, I just thought it was a good talking point because, I love a murder mystery, but my favorite ones are the ones that sort of give you a little bit extra. So something like in addition to think about, not just the plot and who's getting murdered, who did it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think that makes for a more interesting mystery, like when there are the events of the mystery sort of happening that's like, taking up all the characters' attention, and it becomes the focal point of like what they do and the decisions they make. But also they're like life continues, you have to like live the rest of your life like while all this crazy stuff is happening. And so it's interesting to see like how people's internal struggles kind of meet with these like external problems that keep happening. Yeah.
Exactly.
So another thing that I'm really interested in is the way that Lena's decision to pass while she's on this cruise ship and then in New York like also has a lot to do with how race relations differed in the US and the UK at the time. Could you talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, so I guess it was something that became more important as I realized that was going to be sort of a main talking point of the book. So I mean, one of the things that Lena thinks about a lot is, I think in the UK, there was no the claim was that there was no color bar, there was no segregation, but that was just sort of a technicality. Like there were no laws against who could go where, but, you would very likely be asked to leave an expensive restaurant, or you wouldn't be allowed to stay in a 5-star hotel. They would just give you a different excuse. It would never be because you were Black. It would be, we don't seem to have your reservation, or that kind of thing. So I guess the main difference is that in America you kind of knew where you were. You knew you knew what the rules were about where you were able to go, whereas in England, I mean, I set one scene at the Savoy Hotel where Lena actually goes to meet someone before she gets on the ship. And the reason I chose that hotel was a couple of years earlier, Paul Robeson, who was, a massive American actor and he spent a lot of time in London, was acting at the Savoy Theatre, which is like literally next door to the hotel, and was invited by a friend to go and eat at the Savoy Grill in the hotel. But he was asked to leave by the staff because they felt that, they didn't want to cause a ruckus. There were some guests there who might have a problem with him being there. So it wasn't like an explicit rule, but it was just, they were like, well, there are some people here that wouldn't like it. So I kind of wanted to make a nod to that aspect in the book. So it's not that the racism is sort of lesser in the UK, it's just different.
Yeah, it seems like it's in the US, it was sort of like circumscribed by law as well as by sort of social custom, whereas it was mostly sort of social in the UK, sounds like, or custom, or
Yeah.
Wow. And in London, another thing that I was really interested in is the way that you depict London nightclub culture, and like it's very glamorous, but it's also very dangerous, and it reminded me of another recent depiction in Last Night in Soho, I think, which came out last year, I think. But I was wondering, like, if you could talk a little bit about these kinds of places and like how you how you depicted the place where Lena worked before she gets on the ship to go to New York.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been fascinated by Soho because I think in London it was like a place where anyone could go. So it was almost like this melting pot of different cultures and different nationalities, sort of throughout the last few hundred years. And because it's such a great place for jazz, and that's why I've used it in both my books. But then there is that sort of sleazy side, like you said with Last Night in Soho, which I've seen, and I think that's such a great movie at showing that glamour, and then the other side of it, which is quite shocking. So yeah, it was really fun to research. There were quite a few characters, even in the 1930s there was loads of stuff going on. There were gay bars, and there were places where you'd find everyone. You'd find people like almost royalty going to some of these really seedy nightclubs, because it was just like seen as like the place to go. It's like the coolest place in town, if you want to sort of mingle with the riffraff. So it's just a place that everyone could go to, which makes it really fun. And I love reading other people's sort of depictions of Soho as well. I just find it a fascinating place.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think that because you get, because it is like one of these places where so many different kinds of people will come together, that does make for like a lot of interesting stories that you can tell like about that period and about the people who like lived in that world. Yeah, that's really cool. And this is like a life that she inherited from her father, Alfie, who you brought up earlier. And his memory and his influence on her life is really important in this book. And in a way, his death right before the book begins really sets her off on her adventure.
Yeah, I mean, he sort of took over the book a little bit, because he was just supposed to get mentioned in passing. He's kind of part of the reason that she ends up on the ship, sort of coincidentally. But yeah, I felt like his presence was just really important to her. And I guess sort of wanting to respect his memory, I guess, is why she goes through a lot of decisions and these thought processes when she's on the ship as well. Is just trying to, I guess, honor his memory and not let him down, because she's sort of been treading water for a long time, not sure what she should be doing with her life, and with things not having worked out. So yeah, I think he was just really important character, and just someone that I really liked, sort of reliving her memories of him, if that makes sense. Obviously I'm making them up, but yeah.
Absolutely. Like I always thought that must be really fun, like to sort of design, as it were, the backstories of characters, because like, obviously they are like making decisions and doing things in the moment, but they're also influenced by like this whole life that happened off the page that like you don't really get to see. And Alfie, even though he like literally never really appears in the book in the present, is he's such a big presence anyway, because he got her into music, and he helped her, he raised her obviously after her mother left, and she really made a lot of her life choices around his influence. And so it's interesting, like when she is heading off to New York, do you see her as like making a break from that previous life, or is she trying to like continue it to a new level? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I guess a bit of both. I guess the attraction for her with New York is that's where her father was from. So she doesn't know, as far as she knows, she doesn't have, when she sets foot on the ship, as far as she knows, she has no family. Like he was the only family, and he's now dead. So she really had her best friend, who's now left in London, and that's it. So it's kind of like, yes, New York will be a new start. The offer that's been made to her is incredible. So I guess the hope is, although she sort of knows it's too good to be true, the hope is that maybe it is true, because these things do happen. But yeah, I think part of it is almost that she just want to feel like connected to him again, and sort of maybe learn something about him from this sort of mysterious person who used to know him when he was young.
Yeah, that's a really important point, because the person who made this offer to bring her to New York is a past friend of her father's. And she's never met him, and so there's a lot of mystery, but she has a lot to escape from, like in her previous life, because she does have the situation with her friend Maggie and her husband, and she has this opportunity she's fleeing toward. Yeah, like it's very interesting that like her father's death coincides with this like sort of professional and personal catastrophe almost that like
Yeah.
makes going away really really attractive.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess I don't want to spoil anything. I'm just like, no, don't say that. So yeah, I mean, it all makes sense by the end. But yeah, it is, I guess it's just sort of confusing for her, but also she's in that sort of mid-20s stage that I went through when I just didn't know what I was doing with my life or what I wanted to do. I was just sort of coasting along, and then sort of, if someone said you should do this, I'd be like, oh yeah, I'll do it. Yeah, let's give that a try. So she's sort of in that phase of life where she's sort of, I guess, not got anything much to lose. She has nothing. She's literally living in a horrible room with a horrible landlady, and she has no money. So she's just like, well, why not do this?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think it really captures that sort of like mid to late 20s feel very accurately, where like you've spent like the first part of your adulthood kind of trying to be all the things that you think you should be, or that people tell you should be. And then sometime around like your late 20s, maybe getting to 30, you're kind of like, all right, well, let's figure out who I am as opposed to all these outside voices, and I can see that like in her struggle, in this book for sure.
No, I was definitely channeling. I was like, let's use that time that I look back on with dread as like, there's something good.
Oh gosh. Yeah. So, something that I thought that was very interesting about this too is the setting on the cruise ship, because I think that like it's a really good setting for a mystery because it gives you like a little bit of like a locked room type thing. Like you can't escape, you can't go anywhere. It gives you a time limit because you're going to like land in New York at some point, and then like everything has to sort of like be figured out before that. So I'm wondering, like, when you're structuring this story, because there's so many different little moving pieces and so many people that you have to make sure are in the right place at the right time, like how did you approach like plotting that out? Did you have like any visual aids or like maps that helped you kind of figure out like where people were at different times? Or
no, I just I'm not very good at plotting. So the extent of my plotting is I'm like, okay, by the time I get to, I don't know, 40,000 words, someone needs to be dead. And that's kind of how I do it. And I don't always know who the person's going to be. And there's one person that I was going to kill and then I didn't kill them. So, it just sort of goes like that. And I guess one good thing about being in Lena's head, so it being first person, as long as I was following her, it didn't so much matter where everyone else was. Unless she was in a room with, someone's getting killed. But yeah, most of the time I was like, it's a big enough ship that people can be in different places and it kind of works. So yeah, I just sort of winged it. So I'm definitely a pantser. And then, if you change something, I was just like, let's go back and tidy it up a little bit and come back to it. But yeah, I mean, mostly I just tried to sort of go with, I guess, the flow of what was happening. So I guess as I got to sort of each sort of target that I'd sort of set for myself, okay, by this point, this should have happened. I would just sort of, I guess, ramp up whatever was happening, whatever she was doing, put some extra stress on her plate, and then she'd be sort of freaking out over here, and then someone's getting murdered over here. So yeah, I mean, I literally, by the time I thought I knew who the murderer was, and I got to the end of the first draft and I realized it wasn't them. So that's how bad I am at plotting. But it's just because I like to sort of go with, I just kind of like going and seeing where the characters take me, because I'm probably attracted to the characters more than the plot, which can be a bit of a hazard when you're writing a murder mystery because the plot is very important. But yeah, I found that certain characters don't turn out the way I thought they would, and certain characters I thought would only be in like one scene, and then they just keep popping up because I'm kind of just like them a bit too much. I'm like, oh yeah, it'd be interesting to have those two people have a conversation about something. So Dr. Wilding, for example, wasn't really supposed to do very much in the story. He was just supposed to be there as to be a suspect, essentially. But then I sort of wondered who he was and what his story was. And so he had a couple of interesting conversations with Lena and a few arguments at the dinner table, which were quite fun to write. So yeah.
Oh, that's really good to hear, because I liked Dr. Wilding a lot. I thought that,
Good.
Lena spends so much of this book just surrounded by, really terrible white people. And so there's just like there's nice, like her conversations with him are all like pretty nice. And I'm like, oh, that's good. I'm glad she has at least one nice person to
Yeah.
But I like that approach too. Like I'm always really interested that like some writers plot out every single thing ahead of time and they know exactly where stuff's going to go and there's no surprises. And then some people kind of like let the story reveal itself to them almost, and just sort of like follow the characters, like you said. And I think that it's really cool that like such different opposite approaches can like both create like finished products, that are books. And this is a really good book, I think, just to let the characters kind of talk to you, because they're all so interesting and they're like, they have really interesting dynamics because there's so much that they're talking about. And then there's also so much that they are like not talking about very loudly. Like,
I mean, I just had so much fun. I mean, I could have literally written pages of dinner table conversations. I mean, everyone else would have been bored, but I do love a dinner table conversation.
Me too. It's just such an interesting setup, I think, especially with these people who come from like a pretty high social stratum, because dinners in particular are just governed by so much etiquette and like appropriate topics and inappropriate topics. And to see people who like all kind of don't really like each other have to like navigate all that while obeying all these like very strict social rules is an interesting challenge. I think it's really cool. So something that I thought was super interesting too, that kind of links up with that, is that, the cruise ship is like sort of this place where in some respects, like people can mix and meet other people outside of their social class or their profession or what have you. But it also is like a very highly stratified place, because you have like different classes for different passengers, and you have parts of the ship that are available to some but not others. And, like, so that is like it occurs to me that is probably like a particularly high stress place for Lena to be in her situation, because there are so many kind of like social rules in place, and like and the fear of being discovered in a place where boundaries between people are so important is probably really high stress, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean that's why when she first meets Will, who's the musician on board, and he sort of looks at her and knows that she's passing, and she's just terrified that he's going to say something to the wrong person, and but then obviously they become allies, and he ends up being the person that she can trust and go and talk to, because she doesn't have to keep that facade on in front of him. He's sort of the only person that she can just talk to about her life before, essentially. But yeah, it was interesting researching the ship and looking at how like the class system worked, which essentially is, I guess, the same as it does off a ship as well. So if you're in first class, you can go anywhere. But if you're in second, you can't go to first. If you're in third, you can't go to second or first. So basically, the less money you have, the more restricted you are in what you can do. So I guess for Lena, because she is in first class, she can actually go anywhere. And because she's friends with Will, she can go down to the crew quarters and have, I guess, let off some steam. So in some ways, it's stressful for being in the first class section at times, but actually sometimes when she goes down to second class one of the evenings, and then down to the crew quarters, those are kind of the more relaxed places where people aren't there to show off. They're people just there to have like a good time dance and chat, but like just relaxed chat, not, you know, highly charged political conversations about Hitler, which is what's happening up in first class.
Absolutely. Oh gosh, yeah, that's another thing I kind of wanted to talk about is just the Abernathys and how you know, awful they are. they're all like they're all great characters, you know, but they are like sort of challenging people in different, you know, ways. Like they're all just like they're very privileged. They're very self-centered, and you know, when I was thinking, like when you brought up Hitler, like there's a conversation early on in the book where they're talking about the war, and Frankie, one of the Abernathys, this like rich family who Lena is in touch with, says like, oh, well, you know, some of his ideas are okay. And, you know, like not everything he says is bad. And isn't he right about some stuff? And it just sort of like, it just struck home for me how like rich people can talk about these things like they are just you know, dinner conversations, as opposed to like life or death matters for large people, you know, like they're kind of protected from all of the terrible things actually happening in the world because like because they're protected, I guess, you know, they don't have to really feel the consequences of these things as much as some other people do.
Yeah, I think I wanted to have that brought up because I think it still happens now. Like there are always bad things happening in the world, and there's always someone there going, but is it that bad? And you're like, yes, of course it is. This is a terrible thing happening. I'm like, yeah, but he solved the economic problem. Okay, but loads of people are getting murdered. So there's always that person that sort of doesn't care about. I guess we all like to think that, you know, we all like to look down on someone. I think that's like part of the human condition. There always needs to be someone below you. And that's whether they're of a different race or a different class or whatever, or they're an immigrant. There's always that thing that, I don't know, certain types of people will always be like, well, they're not like us, so therefore they're not, like, why should I care? And obviously, you know, I hope that's a very small minority of people, but we see it all the time. And so I did want to flag that up because I think, like I know in the UK, in the press around about 36, obviously this is a few years before the war actually starts, you know, there was a lot of praise for what Hitler was doing. And like nobody cared because they were like, well, you know, it's not people like us. It's a different group of people. So why should we care about them? And that was kind of the argument. So I just wanted to bring it up because I think it is still something we don't learn. I mean, that's what's so interesting about writing historical fiction is that you can totally just write about things that are happening now and tell everyone it's a different decade, and people will be like, oh, this is so terrible. I'm like, have you picked up a paper this week? Because this is exactly what's happening. We just don't learn.
Oh, absolutely. You know, and I was thinking when I was reading that scene, like there are people today, you know, who you know, might say that they agree with like the certain actions of certain politicians, but then when you kind of confront them with what that means that they believe, they'd be like, oh, well, you know, I'm just putting my opinion out there. That was not like a particularly like well enunciated thought, but like I just feel like with Frankie in particular, you know, you get this thing where he like that you see a lot, I think, where people just want to be able to say their political opinions and not have to back them up or defend them at all or face ideas that are different from theirs, you know, like, and that seems to be like an eternal thing. So
yeah.
So could I ask, is there anything else in the future for us with Lena? Do you think we'll see her again anytime, or?
Yeah, you definitely will. I'm hopefully going to get to my editor later today, if I can just finish this last chapter. So there's a sequel, which is going to follow basically the next couple of weeks in Lena's life when she arrives in New York. So mostly set around sort of Harlem, and she's sort of going to look into Alfie a bit more and try and find out, you know, I guess why he kept so many secrets, because she finds out some stuff on the ship about him as well. And yeah, she sort of does a little investigation. I can't really say anything more for spoilers, but yeah, hopefully that will be out at some point next year.
That's awesome. I'm really glad to hear that. And I hope that when that book comes out, you might, come back to talk to us again, because we'd love to hear more from you and more from Lena. So,
Oh, definitely, definitely.
well, thank you so much for making the time to come speak with me and our listeners. And thank you so much for answering my questions. I really enjoyed this.
This was fun. Yeah, thank you for having me.
No problem. Listeners, you can now find Miss Aldridge Regrets at your favorite library or independent bookstore. This has been Jenn in conversation with Louise Hare, and it is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.